Hello, welcome to episode 7 of They Said There Was, the dystopian novel. And we're on chapter 23. She sloped around the house for the next week or so, sometimes in her dressing gown for half the day, sometimes out in the garden, just sitting. She didn't even water the plants she was supposed to be so keen on, he noticed, as he looked up from his computer. Just sat, like some kind of zombie, doing nothing. He wasn't getting much achieved either. It had been a confusing time, made worse by the fact that some idiot at the office had posted out the wrong files to him, sending him his tax documents for the year instead of the letter he was supposed to receive with the instructions for his role. The parcel hadn't turned up either, and he'd had to make a special journey to the office to see the manager in person after a long think about it, because he couldn't seem to get through on the phone lines either. The line kept getting cut off, just as he was about to say he needed to speak to the manager about the letter. They kept saying the manager said it's in the post. Then when he went to explain the situation further so they could let him speak to the manager, the line just went dead. The office would be locked up tight, of course, when he got there, what with the skeleton staff and no clients about due to the rules changing in the pandemic. But he'd phoned the front desk right outside, pointing out that he was here in person, and they could buzz him in the way they did for staff on days they were shut to the public but still working away. That hadn't worked out either, as they'd said they couldn't let him in. He pointed out that he was fully vaccinated and not a danger to anyone, but they insisted the manager wasn't there when he did. He asked to speak to the main manager of the entire department, but he wasn't available either. Then the click that signalled them hanging up. When he'd arrived home, Deirdre had realised he'd been out. He hadn't told her he was going to the office because she wasn't talking sense to him whenever she did talk. She kept saying that he'd lost his job and should start accepting that, clearly just to upset him. She wanted an argument, and he was damned if he was going to let her have it. She ambushed him several times, saying she wanted to talk, but a brief reminder that there was nothing to talk about, or a simple "I've said my piece," was enough to get her to stop baiting him into a fight. Once she didn't move out of the way when he tried to get past her into the office, but he waved her away and she backed down. He was being attacked in his own home, and the only safe place to escape the ambushes was in the office. It was quiet in there, and she knew she was unwelcome. He got headaches more frequently over those few weeks. He wondered if the chair was to blame. It was not an ergonomically designed, adjustable office chair, after all, and didn't have that curved bit you could move up and down to hold your back straight. The kitchen chair that had been in the room as long as he could remember might be causing him to slouch and putting pressure on his back. It was a bit too high off the desk as well, and he noticed now that he had to bend his upper back to write in his notebook if he was filling in one of the statistics for deaths, or how many people in hospital that had been diagnosed with the illness this week, or the monthly figures, or copying over a pie chart or something. He decided that it might be a good idea to take an extra break, since no real office duties could be performed until the letter arrived, and he had more time to fill in. This short extra break could be used to spend time lying on the bed to straighten out his back and hopefully get rid of the headaches. He couldn't combine it with his tea break because he can't drink tea lying down. Headache tablets seem to do little except put the pain behind a wall, somewhere not as insistent and throbbing as the pain before taking them, but still there. And it was still making him feel unwell enough that even his stomach felt nauseous. 10 minutes lying down on the camp bed mid-morning and again mid-afternoon with the curtains drawn to eliminate the light from the back garden might do the trick. He decided to leave the radio news on, since it was a less of a waste of time if he was keeping up with the news while lying there. It seemed to help, although the headache often returned in the evenings as bad as it had been on waking up. His pillow might be getting worn out and flat, he thought, in the double bed, and that might be the source of the problem. He'd have to ask Deirdre to get a new one soon, but he had no desire to talk to her at the moment, in the state she was in. Her bedtime routine had changed, along with her demeanour, and she was no longer sitting up in bed, reading one of her books when he retired for the night. These days, she was asleep before him, leaving the light on for him to change into pyjamas and hang his suit up. Finally, the shipment with the next batches of injections had arrived, some by plane, some by boat, and it was exciting watching the news footage of all the equipment needed, extra medical protective clothing as well, apparently, arriving into the country. One of the planes was met by an official party and a dignitary arriving as an ambassador to personally supervise the organisation behind rushing the urgently needed supplies to the nation, was met and greeted by our nation's leader. They didn't shake hands, of course, as in the old times, because it wasn't safe to do so, but they held their hands up in a salute that was meant to convey a sincere gratitude and respect for the other representative. It was very moving, and the brass band playing was stirring, although classical music wasn't usually of interest to him. Later, he felt very anxious again, though, although the news had left him in a very stirred-up mood. Perhaps the emotion of jubilation was a contrasting emotion that helped make things seem worse than they were, because, of course, he still had the big problem of the letter. It hadn't arrived. He would be in terrible trouble in work if he didn't get it, and start working on getting the files and unemployment forms filled in that would have been accumulating in his office inbox soon. He'd have to go to the office again and somehow get to the manager and explain that there were problems which prevented him from starting that needed to be resolved. He thought about this during the day and how to phrase it so that he didn't appear to be blaming the Human Welfare Office for any of the problems he was encountering due to the hold-ups with the letter. Clearly, he wasn't meant to be waiting about this long before starting, as he was vital to the smooth running of the filing systems with all the unemployed's records. Something had gone very awry. He arrived at the office the second time in a determined mood. This had to be resolved, and the only way to do so was to see the manager. He'd failed repeatedly due to the incompetence of the front desk staff to understand the importance of his having a direct line of communication with management to fix the problem once and for all. He was getting into that office today. and would wait for as long as it took to see the manager. The manager would understand why he hadn't been able to get a formal time slot to see him once he'd explained the missing letter and the difficulty getting through from the switchboard via the front desk employees. And since he didn't know the names of anyone at the front desk, there wouldn't be a particular person directly blamed, but he'd still make it very clear that the problem was with the switchboard, not with himself, and with whoever had not put him through the numerous times he'd called about the issue with the letter not arriving. How to get in, though? Again, it was locked tight, and in his mind's eye, he almost expected to see a queue of ragged unemployed waiting for opening time at the front doors. But of course, all that had changed in the new times we were in now with the pandemic. It had created all kinds of unexpected problems, like the one he was trying to solve now. All doors were closed. This was normal at the car park at the side of the building, since it was a precaution against drunken unemployed persons gaining access to intimidate staff or damage property. It didn't open from the outside without his plastic ID card, but along with his login password, they had changed his card pass details, obviously, since he tried to swipe his card through the metal card reader last time to gain entry and failed. He got out of his car to try again. It still didn't work. This wasn't surprising, really, if he was working from home, as they probably had planned for him to post his files in so that he would not have to travel to the office personally with them. This was a measure meant to save him valuable work time travelling back and forth, with delays and roadblocks inevitable. It had taken him hours just to get through traffic, although it was very light with so few on the roads because of the blocks. Then he'd had to explain to the police that checked all the drivers about his card being replaced. He'd fibbed slightly and said he was going in to pick up his new one today when they were examining it along with his other identification papers and his vaccine status details from the phone, which he took a while to access and had to be given back the phone when the police officer pointed out that he was showing him his phone contacts by asking, "Who is this contact?" holding the phone out for him to see with his wife's number displaying. He explained his wife was vaccinated as well, but not an essential worker, and was at home. In her cocoon, he added, laughing. The officer didn't seem to hear the little joke. Eventually, the traffic moved, though, and he was pulling into the car park. He walked around to the front entrance of the building, which was also closed, just to check it was locked. Yes, there were lights on, but nobody home, as they say. There was no intercom, as the unemployed would be likely to abuse this facility if placed in a position near the queue, and had played nasty pranks before. He'd heard a worker on his break saying, involving use of foul language and even chewing gum stuck to it, despite the security camera pointing down on the queue for monitoring them from somewhere within. Probably the overmanager's office, which he'd noticed had a multi-screen display on one of the two computer screens, which he'd seen at a meeting when seated somewhere to the side of the desk, the room not being big enough to accommodate all the staff at the meeting easily. He'd phoned them again, thinking perhaps he'd be lucky, but couldn't get a line that wasn't busy, no matter how many attempts. He kept redialing and trying as he made his way back to the car. He'd have to wait until someone came out the side door and then make his way in if he had no success. Then he'd present himself at the front desk and voila, the manager would be informed he was waiting to talk to him. Still no clear line through to the switchboard. They must be very busy today. He looked at the time display. Nearly 10 to 11. He must have been a very long time in the traffic check, since he'd set out at the usual time he used to go to work in the old days before this all happened. He walked towards the side door, climbing 3 steps and standing to the side so the door wouldn't bump him back down them when it opened. He leaned on the rail beside the steps, near the swipe card machine, and waited for one of the smokers in the staff to emerge. As it turned out, he wasn't waiting long. The door swung open and a co-worker appeared, making his way outside with his paper cup, a cigarette packet held awkwardly alongside in the same hand, while he pushed the door open with a swooping motion with the other. "Oh, morning there. I'm just going to see the manager," he said in his cheerful work voice. Then, when the worker was almost through the door, had half turned to look at him, but had let his arm drop with the door starting to swing shut again, and he sidestepped around him and nipped through the door before it closed. No point in standing around talking about pass cards, he thought, when he knows who I am. It was one of the workers he knew took illicit breaks with others, breaking the rules and standing far too close for safety while doing so. Chapter 24. He made his way towards the front desks. There were only 2 people there, a man and a woman. The woman was probably the one who didn't put him through properly to the manager. So he approached the man, a worker he'd seen before, but whose name he couldn't remember. Joe, maybe, but he wasn't sure. They should wear labels, really. But of course, they wouldn't want the unemployed knowing their names, since they couldn't be trusted not to harass you or your family if their claims were cut off. Phones were ringing everywhere, and there was a phone on the worker's desk somewhere. He wasn't answering it, but doing something on the computer. Robert stood at the window with the interview seat and plastic screen between him and the man on the other side. The man continued on working. "Maybe he doesn't see me." He coughed, then hoped the man didn't think he was ill, then followed with, "Excuse me." The man looked up. He had a very surprised expression on his face. "It's me, Robert. I need to see the overmanager." The man still looked surprised for some reason. "I'm not an unemployed. I work here." It had occurred to him that this Joe fella, or whatever his name was, mightn't know him personally, since they worked in different departments. He gave his second name as requested, and the man looked up his details on the computer, checking his date of birth to ensure he wasn't an imposter, as they must do by rote, since the unemployed tried lying about their details often. There were none of them here today, so the waiting area smelled fresh, like bleach with a faint hint of lemons, which was preferable to the cigarette-y and bodily smell the unwashed secreted. "Robert," the man said, "you don't work here anymore. Your contract was terminated weeks ago." The man turned from the screen and looked up at Robert in a very hostile way. Robert paused. "No, it hasn't. Don't be ridiculous." It wasn't wise to take this tone, possibly, but he was looking at the wrong information on his screen, this stupid Joe person. "Please check you spelled my name correctly. And," he added, "my date of birth." Such incompetence. "The details are correct, Robert," the Joe person said, with the same very cold look on his face. He wasn't even looking at the screen, just staring at Robert. Robert looked around towards the next person at the front desk. Perhaps he should have chosen her to talk to. She had turned her head in his direction, but had a look on her face that looked like surprise. Her mouth was slightly open. That often meant surprise. She must be surprised that he wasn't being recognized. "You recognize me, don't you?" he appealed to the woman. "Yes, It's Robert, isn't it? Yes. You see, I just need to see the manager. He moved towards the next window and pulled the chair out to sit down and start again. He could see the Joe person leaving his seat, and there appeared to be someone approaching him from behind, judging by the sounds of footsteps that suddenly stopped behind him. He glanced back. It was a security guard. Now, Robert, the security guard said. There was a co-worker beside him, the one he'd passed when coming in the side door. What do you want? He asked, annoyed at being interrupted, right as he was about to start giving his details. The security man looked threatening too, looming so close over him. And what did the other guy want, hanging around behind him, watching him conduct his private business? It was too much. He turned and continued, trying to ignore the distraction and explain his details to the woman, who wasn't moving, but still frozen, with her mouth slightly open. The Joe person was approaching them too, from the other side of the screen, and the overmanager was with him. At last, it had registered finally that he needed to see the manager and who he was. The overmanager leaned forward over the woman close to the window, resting his hands on the desk. What do you want, Robert? Your files have already gone out. All your tax certificates are complete, and you do not have authorization to enter this building when you are no longer employed here. Now please leave, or you will be ejected. Ejected. Robert realized why the security guard was looming just behind him. He realized what the expressions meant, and the co-worker standing behind him. They thought he shouldn't have entered without his card. It was too ridiculous because they knew him. But I work here, he replied, bewildered by the overreaction. Security guards were to deal with the unemployed, not their own workers. You were terminated, Robert. Do you not understand what that entails? You don't work here anymore. You were let go, fired. Now please leave. Your tax certs were sent out. I had the sub-manager of the department check the date it went out personally because you kept calling us. His tone was extremely firm. In fact, he seemed to be almost shouting some words. He knew what the word terminated meant, but he'd only seen it used on the unemployed. Now, incredibly, he was seated on one of the unemployed seats at the unemployment window, being told he was terminated like an unemployed person would be. Fired. He'd used the words fired and not working here as well. There was no other way to interpret it, except he was fired. Maybe? Does that mean fired as in no longer in the office, just working from my office at home? His voice came out sounding very faint and hoarse. No, it means you don't have a job anymore with us. You've been fired. You're free to take up work elsewhere, should it become available, and you should be looking for something else immediately, of course. There are plenty of positions available for a man with your skill sets, I'm sure. It was the start of the speech from the middle section of the unemployed interview, from the handbook he'd been studying up on for his promotion. He recognized it from reading it so many times. He continued to sit, although the overmanager had pulled a black screen down from the top of the plastic window that said, "Position closed." After a moment, he noticed he was being addressed again from behind, the security guard repeating that he was to leave the office. He stood on shaky legs, turning, and the guard stood back to give him room to leave, blocking him from exiting the way he'd come in, through the door to the car park, pointing instead to the front entrance and jangling his bunch of keys, ready to open it when Robert had reached the door. There was nothing to do but leave. He could hear the door being locked again behind him. He was reluctant to leave the vicinity of the building, as it somehow made it more final what had been said to him. But he was sure that there was no way back. So he made his way shakily to the car, found his keys, and sat for a while until the security guard came out the side door and told him to go. He drove towards home, but didn't remember anything of the journey and was surprised to find himself parked in his usual spot near the house without knowing how he'd made the journey. Everything seemed unreal. He sat in his car for a while until someone walking past caught his eye and he felt self-conscious, parked in the street, but not going anywhere. He headed to the house. Deirdre was out somewhere. He was glad of the quiet. He couldn't face the office and the sense of failure that awaited him there. So he stood at the living room window, not really doing anything. The streets were fairly empty as usual, and there was little motor traffic either. He felt agitated, but couldn't have gone for a walk to work the agitation off if he'd wanted to. He might be arrested for breaking the rules, and it would look crazy walking back and forth on the street. The house felt very small and claustrophobic suddenly, so he kept looking at the street. Two women were making their way home with plastic bags, groceries presumably. A man was walking a dog, waiting for it to relieve itself under a small tree which had been planted in a round hole in the pavement. A group of children went by, one wheeling a bicycle, another a football, and there were two others. They were all breaking the rules, none of them in masks, and all standing too close, and too many of them in the group. The world had gone crazy, and nobody was following the rules anymore, not even the rule that said he should have his job and get his promotion. Things weren't working the way they were supposed to, and it wasn't fair on him. What was he supposed to do now? Nobody had even told him this much. After the years of service and the hard work to build his career and climb up to management level with the sweat of his own brow, they'd just thrown him aside for no good reason. His thoughts whirled. He should look at the tax things they'd sent him, but he couldn't bear to yet. Maybe later. He needed air. He didn't feel well at all. He opened his front door and stood in the small porch as it had started to drizzle. He wished he smoked, briefly, as it would have given him something to do that didn't appear odd. The air was cool at least. He paused to take some deep breaths before putting on his mask, rustling in his pocket for it. They hadn't worn masks at the office, he suddenly thought, outraged at the fact that the overmanager and the man at the desk, and even the woman beside her, had been maskless. Only the security guard had worn a mask while he was there. It was very ominous, this ignoring of the rules, even if they were injected and not dealing with the public. The rules were rules. He felt his face getting hot and his heart rate zooming up at the injustice when he had followed all the rules and every order he had ever been given and they had not. Someone was opening the next door's gate and walking up the path. It was her, the woman from the shop that he'd seen again, and she had the bicycle and was going visiting to his neighbour. No mask, out gallivanting on a bike. He stared at her. Hello, she had spoken directly to him. Hello, he answered automatically. It was probably a bad answer. He didn't want her to imagine for a second that he approved of her behaviour. She headed for the side door of the house, he noticed, instead of calling at the front. So she must be a close friend of whoever lived there. And she hadn't left her bikes locked up on the street. There weren't any bike spaces, but who would let someone bring a bike into their house unless they were a friend? He leaned forwards, further out of the porch, cautiously, to see if he could overhear the conversation when the door opened. There was none, just a brief sound of a bike rattling, maybe getting leaned on a wall. He heard the door shut, though, so she'd gotten in. Someone she knew very well, then, if she'd skipped the greeting. He looked around, hoping nobody had seen him stick his neck out so far to investigate, and saw his wife's car approaching. There was someone else in it with her. What on earth was going on? She had no mask either, and it was one of her female friends, the one with the high-pitched, horrible laugh. What an insane day. He ducked back into the house and positioned himself at the living room window. Chapter 25. The final cohort were done, and he was shocked to discover that some had refused. A small proportion, according to the news reports, under 10%, but that seemed like a huge figure to him, given the population of the country, which he'd looked up when they said it. They should insist they get it. It was the law, surely. If this thing was killing people, it should be the law that everyone had to get it. Drag them off to the doctors, look up who they were, and find them and haul them away. Whatever it took. They had to, because they were saying that unless they got 100% of people globally to take this injection, it didn't work. And the infected could reinfect the vaccinated. He hadn't known this could happen, but it was shocking. He'd been a bit lax himself since he'd got his injection because he wasn't aware of this. How could he have overlooked this fact? He must be far more careful from now on and probably shouldn't even be going to the shop. Let his wife take the risks, since she was determined to disobey sensible rules. The country was going to slowly reopen, nevertheless, because a lot of businesses had taken a bad hit, what with closures, and they needed to get their customers back, and services needed to resume to get life going again. It was like pressing a pause button on the computer screen. Another click and things would start springing to life again. Shops would open the following week and the road checks would stop as well, now that most people were vaccinated. Robert thought this unwise, since the unvaccinated could be arrested if they kept this going. But for some reason they didn't want to follow the rules, even with this a distinct possibility. He supposed the focus was just on resuming life first. Then they'd have all those who had refused or neglected to get their jabs, as people on the radio call them now, done, would be contacted and told they had to come in to get it done or be arrested. He thought how pleasant a sight that would be, to see police arrive at the doors of those on the street who thought they could evade the authorities. He might even see it, now that he was at home and looking out the window so often. That might be interesting. He'd been in the back garden a few times, and Deirdre hadn't been doing anything with the plants. He could tell because there were long shriveled stems instead of living plants in the vegetable beds. It was hard to tell though, because they might die off a bit in autumn like the leaves on the trees outside the house. She still was in the garden a bit, but not moving very much. Still at the sitting business, just sitting and doing nothing, whenever he reminded her of the time and the meal that needed to get prepared. He was in the habit of sitting in his car, revving the motor to make sure the engine still worked several times a week. But one Saturday, after returning from the petrol station, which there were many more cars at now, since the traffic on the roads was much heavier, with travel further being allowed, he noticed she was late arriving back from the supermarket. This was annoying because she usually started the lunch straight after getting back, and it was now very near lunchtime, as another look at his phone confirmed. He waited for another hour, amusing himself by watching people pass. Many more now were on the street than previously had been, before eventually deciding he had to make his own sandwich and tea, yet again. By late afternoon she was still gone. Perhaps she was with one of her friends off somewhere. Probably they were in a pub, or one of their houses getting drunk. This couldn't go on, the defiant attitude and the lack of respect for him. It wasn't acceptable to just disappear. As the day wore on, he felt more annoyed, and even the news discussion panels on the evening didn't take his mind off it very much. At 10:14 p.m., his phone rang in his pocket. It was Deirdre. "Where are you?" "Robert, I'm at my parents'. I'm staying here for a while. I have to think about you and I don't think I'll be returning, to be honest. It's just broken down completely, and I can't fix it. I've tried, but you won't talk to me." Oh, for God's sake, she was blubbering and hardly able to be understood. "Do you have to make a big drama out of everything?" "Just fuck off, Robert. I'm gone. I'll get my stuff out and you'll be rid of me. There's no point in trying to talk even." She'd hung up. The bitch had actually hung up on him after he'd waited all day for her. What stuff was she talking about? He sat trying to work out the mechanics of a female mind, knowing he'd little hope. She sounded like she was going to be at her parents' for a while. They lived a long way away, so she'd have to come back, then go back again. So as for returning, she was contradicting herself there. The only thing broken, it seemed, was her. She looked permanently broken, the way she moped about the place. She must be intending to get books and clothes if she was taking a holiday with her parents. Not even telling him first, to see if it suited him either. No, leaving him alone to fend for himself while she had a holiday. He thought about her parents. Dull people. Cheerful but boring. Talked a lot about gardens, if he remembered, the last time he'd been there, and he didn't like the food, or the fact that they drank in the evenings. He'd felt ignored and hated going there. It was very odd in the house without her. Not exactly quieter, since she hadn't had her awful friends in ages, but you could sense something was gone that should be there, like when you move a side table into another room and keep expecting to see it in the same place. He had the run of the living room to himself now, though, and felt freer. He'd pulled up the coffee table from her side of her easy chair and put his feet up on it when he was watching the news programmes. He could catch these in the daytime as well now, without her moving about or leaving her things near his seat. He'd slipped a bit in the first week about his lunch and dinner times, as he struggled to remember what he'd usually have for dinner or how to make it, or put off making a sandwich at lunch until his stomach told him it didn't like waiting. The dinner times were the most difficult part of the new home routine. He had no idea how to make a dinner. He could cook an egg and could cook potatoes boiled as well. He could even cook canned things that needed reheating, but wasn't sure about how to do meat without risking food poisoning. It would be ironic, he told himself, if I survived the virus but died of food poisoning. He looked in the freezer compartment of the fridge. He'd seen her take things to cook out of there. There was something in a container, frozen, that he didn't recognize, and something in a packet beside it that he did. He didn't know how to cook it, though. It was a meat pie, according to the picture. It said oven and microwave on the top. So he put it in the microwave and pressed 30 minutes, as that was how long it was until dinner time. The pie didn't turn out very well. It was very hot on the outside, but cold in the middle. He left the plate without finishing it and settled down for all the latest developments. He could eat out in restaurants when they reopened and could get fancy breakfasts in the garage if he wished to as well. It might be better without her. The washing up was a problem, but if he ate out, it wouldn't be. He thought of the vaccine refusers and wondered if they would be eating out as well. It might not be worth it if you had the possibility of them reinfecting you, although most of them were probably unemployed and they saved their money for drinking. The old people ate out a lot, he remembered, from seeing them having tea at restaurant windows to gossip about others, as they had little else to do. They probably would be keen on getting their injections, though, so they wouldn't be a risk. They looked dirty, a lot of them, mind you, he thought, having been watching them more closely recently. And usually they didn't wear their masks up high enough on their shrunken little faces to keep the virus at bay. Maybe eating out was a bad idea. And he had food in the house, did he? She hadn't returned with the shopping. On the Saturday she should have been doing it. That was how little she cared about his health or well-being generally. She didn't deserve to be married, a woman like that. What about work? How was she going to go back to school when the schools opened again after the summer if she was staying at her parents' so many miles away from it? She'd have to come back soon, he realized, and not to pick up her things, but because she wouldn't manage to get to work without staying nearer to home. Ha! She'd come back with her tail between her legs soon, full of apologies. He'd take her back because it was the decent thing to do, but not put up with any more nonsense. She would be embarrassed about her behaviour, probably, and try to please him a bit again. About time that everything went back to normal, including his marriage. The news investigation was interesting that night, as it was about the refusers. They showed clips of their nation's leader at a conference where he was joking about, clearly relieved about the last cohorts getting their injections delivered. He called the ones that hadn't refuseniks, which was funny because it sounded like they were revolting, and they were really. He pointed out that they would be educated in a targeted way about how important it was to take the injection. They would need it to get any doctor to see them, and they were putting others at risk, according to the latest science. So he couldn't let them carry on in their antisocial way, not understanding that they weren't living up to their duties to others, or caring about people who were most at risk, as the science said, the old and those who were already very vulnerable to the virus, being in poor health already. It was shocking that so many old and sick people were dying all around them, and they seemed not to care. They were doing research into this and found that it was mostly ignorance and lack of education about how dangerous it was not to follow all the rules that were good for everyone, not just themselves, because they were members of society. Pity thought Robert. Pity they are in society. He wished people like that didn't exist. They created problems for everyone, like the fact that they could infect you just because of their fear of getting a simple injection. Another speaker on the panel that was analysing the statements different world leaders had made in their daily briefings to the press that assembled and recorded what they said to provide insight and information to the public, said that it was fear of science that was wrong with these sorts of people. They were anti everything because they just didn't want to take personal responsibility for anything in their lives. Yes, that was very true. Like Deirdre and her friends, ignoring the danger and just thinking of short term gains and their own pleasure. He was reminded of this many times over the next couple of weeks as he struggled alone to learn how to do women's work. He shouldn't have to seek out socks in the mornings when he was built to kill tigers in the jungle and fight for survival out in the world. She had hidden basic things in the strangest places. He had to go hunting to find them, and only after suffering the same socks for 2 days did he find a stash of them squirreled away in a press near the heater for the hot water on a top shelf. He wasn't doing very well on food either. There didn't seem to be much he knew how to cook or how to combine with other things to make meals. He couldn't remember what he usually ate most of the time. He didn't know how to make the shepherd's pie he liked, or even the red stuff for the spaghetti she usually made when she couldn't be bothered making something more appetizing. Sometimes he made another sandwich for tea, heating it up on the pan, trying not to burn it. It was hot at least, and didn't require anything beyond being able to butter bread and cut cheese. Even finding a sharp knife took him a while to do, since the knife she used for cheese wasn't out on the draining board in its container anymore. She kept it in a drawer for some reason, with a lot of other knives. Why she needed more than one sharp knife was mysterious. Bread came already sliced from the shop. He knew that.